Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather. Today we're telling the story of Nanny Doss, also known as the Giggling Granny. Nanny is an American serial killer responsible for up to 11 deaths. Probably one of the first known female serial killers of her time. You'll find out why she's called the Giggling Granny. And this case is old, but it's interesting how she got away with murder for so long. Let's jump in. Nanny Doss was born November 4th, 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, one of 5 children. She has 1 brother and 3 sisters, born to Louisa, people called her Lou, and James Hazel. Apparently, Nanny disliked James, her father. Some accounts say that Lou also wasn't really fond of her husband either. He was apparently very strict, controlling, and just said to be a really nasty old man. He often forced the children to work on the farm instead of sending them to school, which resulted in Nanny not doing very well in school. She didn't get good grades and she made very few friends. It's also rumored that Nanny was conceived illegitimately, as James and Lou married after 1905, the year Nanny was born. In those times, having a baby out of wedlock was frowned upon, even for small-town farmers. But Lou and James would get married and go on to have more children. When Nanny was around 7 years old, the family took a train to visit relatives in southern Alabama. The train would make a sudden stop, resulting in Nanny hitting her head on a metal bar in front of her. And she probably suffered a concussion, but in 1912, nobody knew what that was or how to properly treat a head injury. After that incident, Nanny suffered from blackouts and depression and severe headaches for the rest of her life. She would later blame her mental instability on that incident, which could very well be true. While growing up, Nanny didn't have much of a social life. She also wasn't really allowed to have one either. Her father forbid her and her sisters from going out, seeing friends, and most of all, dating. They had to wear very conservative clothing with no makeup at all. James believed trying to make them less attractive or dressing more modestly would prevent them from being molested. Nanny later claimed that she was actually molested by several local men, and this occurred before her mid-teens. However, she also admitted that she rebelled and snuck out a lot to be with men in the hayloft. When she was at home and not sneaking out of the house, one of her only hobbies was reading her mom's romance magazines, and her favorite was reading the Lonely Hearts columns. If you don't know what that is, it's basically like printed Craigslist ads for people looking for love that you could find in the back of magazines or sometimes the newspaper. When Nanny was just 15 years old, she met a man named Charles Bragg, who was a coworker of hers at the linen thread company where she worked. He was tall, handsome, and apparently just doted on Nanny in the beginning of their relationship. After only knowing each other for about 4 months, Nanny and Charles tied the knot. When Charles asked for her hand in marriage, her father approved, so Nanny did too. I'm sure it seemed like the perfect opportunity to leave the house and get away from her controlling father. Unfortunately for Nanny, she went from one controlling man to another. She also ended up with a mother-in-law who was just as awful. Charles Bragg was the only son of his unmarried mother who insisted that she live with them. Charles's mom was very needy and very codependent. Apparently, she took up a lot of Charles's time and attention and prevented Nanny from doing things that she wanted to do. For example, if Nanny wanted to go to a movie or dinner, her mother-in-law would suddenly come down with these spells or dizziness, nausea, or something to prevent them from leaving the house. This meant that she spent a lot of time unhappy at home. Nanny and Charles would have 4 daughters within a 4-year period: Gertrude, Zelma, Florine, and Melvina. Having 4 small children, a cranky mother-in-law, and being a housewife to Charles really took its toll on Nanny. She began to drink a lot, smoked regularly, and grew quite the mean streak. They eventually fell out of love, and it was actually really rare that they were ever seen together. This led both Charles and Nanny to cheat on each other. Then, in August of 1927, Zelma passed away, and then strangely in September, 1 month later, they lost Gertrude. The two children who passed died very unexpectedly. Both kids seemed fine at breakfast and then died by lunchtime while Charles was at work. Both deaths were ruled as accidental food poisoning. They did end up benefiting from small insurance policies that were put on the kids, but Charles became very suspicious and took the oldest daughter, Melvina, the family pet, and left. Nanny was left with their newborn and the cranky mother-in-law. It was later learned that Charles had actually stopped eating meals prepared by Nanny or drinks when Nanny was in a foul mood. He just didn't trust her at all, and he knew that she was up to something. Charles was gone for an entire year before he returned. His mother had since passed away of apparent natural causes, but he brought with him a new girlfriend. Nanny and Charles Bragg would divorce, and Nanny would get both their daughters back. Nanny then took the girls and moved back home with her parents, and soon turned to the Lonely Hearts column in the newspaper and met Frank Harrelson. They married in 1929, but the honeymoon stage didn't last long when Nanny realized Frank was an alcoholic and had spent some time in jail for assault. Nanny's bad moods returned, but they stayed married for a long 16 years, with Frank regularly drinking. He allegedly physically assaulted her, yelled at her and the kids, and life with him was just really unpleasant. By early 1940, her two daughters had grown and married. Melvina, the oldest, had a son in 1943 and was pregnant again in 1945. The second pregnancy was really hard on Melvina, and she requested her mother to be by her side during the birth. After a long, hard labor, Melvina gave birth to a daughter, but sadly the baby had died just an hour later. Melvina and her husband were both sleeping while Nanny was watching the newborn during that first hour. And Melvina would later say that she thought she dreamt that her mother had stuck a hat pin in the soft spot on the newborn's head while cradling her. But since Melvina had taken surgical ether for the birth, she couldn't know for certain if that was just a dream. Things were really fuzzy for her, but her husband would later say that he thinks that he remembers Nanny fiddling with a hat pin earlier in the evening. It's believed that the loss of this baby led Melvina and her husband to drift apart and get a divorce. Melvina ended up dating a new man. One night, Melvina and this new man would get into an argument, and she would leave the house to go and see her dad, leaving her son in the care of Nanny. Her son would pass away while in her care. The doctor diagnosed the death as asphyxia, but Nanny played the grieving grandma and insisted she didn't know what happened. Several months later, Nanny collected a small amount of life insurance that she took out on her grandson. And I think at this point, Melvina and her mother probably stopped talking to each other. Then, in 1945, Frank went out and celebrated with his friends because soldiers were returning home after Japan surrendered during the war. Nanny would say that he became belligerently drunk and demanded sex from her when he got home. She claims to have said no, but he threatened to leave her so she would give in, but apparently was really mad about that. The next day, she found Frank's corn liquor, which I think is moonshine, and topped it up with rat poison. Frank died later that evening. Doctors simply suspected he died from being unhealthy from all of his drinking. It said that Nanny traveled around after Frank's death and eventually landed in Lexington, North Carolina. She jumped back on the Lonely Hearts column and in 1947 met Arlie Lanning. They married 2 days later. Their marriage wasn't terrible, but Arlie also drank a lot and liked to flirt with other women. When his behavior became too much, Nanny would pack a suitcase and take off, sometimes for months on end. Then out of the blue, she would return home, he would sober up, and they would be a happy married couple again. The neighbors thought that she seemed like a loving wife, often seeing pies cooling in the window, fresh hung laundry outside, the garden was always kept, and her trips away would be excused as simply relatives being sick or tending to her sister or helping her elderly mother. Arlie would die in 1950 caused by heart failure. Nanny said that they had coffee and prune cake in the morning and he appeared to be fine. Then just 2 days later, he died. Doctors suspect it was just the flu because he wasn't really in the best shape due to his drinking. Strangely, just 8 weeks after Arlie passed, the home that he and Nanny lived in burnt down to the ground. Apparently, this house was to go to Arlie's sister, as stated in the will, but some would suspect that Nanny was unhappy by that decision and burned it down on purpose. There was insurance on the house, but the insurance policy made a check payable to Arlie Lanning, even though he was deceased. That check was mailed to Arlie's mother's house. Arlie's mother then strangely died in her sleep. Nanny then took the check, cashed it, and went to live with her ill sister, who also died in her sleep. Guess what she did next? Back on the dating scene. Then comes Richard. Nanny and Richard met through a correspondence association for those looking for life partners. Richard would find Nanny through the association and instantly thought that she was the woman for him. He asked to be deleted from the availability list, and they wed on October in 1952. Nanny would soon learn that Richard was in deep debt and had another girl on the side. Richard would occasionally take trips to the store that lasted a little too long for Nanny's liking, so one day she followed him and found that he was seeing another woman. Nanny went back to the Lonely Hearts column in the Kansas papers behind Richard's back. Richard to her became repulsive, and she wanted out of the relationship. But Richard's life was spared a few months because James, Nanny's father, had died back home on Blue Mountain. When her father died, Lou came to live with Nanny and Richard, so Nanny kept Richard alive just a little while longer. In January 1953, within days of staying with Nanny and Richard, Lou would have extreme stomach pains and eventually died. Sadly, 3 months later, in May, Richard would die as well. Nanny would collect 5 insurance policies that she had on Richard. 2 of her sisters died that same year in different towns, each collapsing while Nanny was visiting, each with the same mysterious symptoms of stomach cramps and convulsions. Lastly, we come to Sam Doss. Sam was a minister who lost his family in a tornado in Madison County, Arkansas. He had been one of Nanny's pen pals, and when Richard died, Nanny went straight to Tulsa, Oklahoma to meet Sam for the first time. Sam enjoyed her company, helped her cook, liked to spend time with her, and wasn't at all like her previous husbands. He was set in his ways, though, and being a minister, he didn't approve of Nanny reading romance magazines or novels. He wasn't a fan of the TV and liked to schedule their lives right down to the day they would have sex. He controlled when they watched TV, what she watched, the use of the electric fan, and when the lights could be turned on and off. Nanny eventually took a break from Sam and headed home to Alabama. Sam was devastated. So to win her back, he wrote her a loving apology letter. He rearranged his banking to allow her equal access and took out 2 life insurance policies on himself for her. That obviously did the trick because Nanny would go back to Sam and resumed their relationship. In September of 1953, Nanny poisoned Sam with one of her famous prune cakes. This cake is apparently the same recipe used to kill many of her other victims. Sam didn't die right away like the rest. Instead, he became so ill that he was in bed for days, eventually losing up to 16 pounds. His doctor would finally send him to the hospital where he stayed an additional 23 days to recover, apparently diagnosed with a severe infection to his digestive tract. When he got home, Nanny made him a lovely roast, but first a cup of coffee. That cup of coffee was spiked with arsenic. Sam died that night right before midnight. This time, Sam's doctor became suspicious because when he sent Sam home from the hospital, he was much better. It was Sam's doctor who ordered the autopsy and found an extreme amount of arsenic in his system. Nanny was then promptly arrested. During questioning, Nanny giggled a lot, which is why she was eventually named the Giggling Granny or the Giggling Nanny. She also sat for hours in the interrogation room reading romance novels while the police were trying to question her. The police would finally have to take her book away, and it was then that she finally admitted to killing Sam. Her excuse was that, quote, "He wouldn't let me watch my favorite program, and he made me sleep without the fan on the hottest nights. What was a woman to do?" End quote. She would only continue to talk about the other murders if the police agreed to give her back her book. While giggling, she said that she didn't kill for money, but because her husbands were all duds. She simply wanted romance. The bodies of all of her husbands, her mother, her sister Dovie, her nephew, and mother-in-law were all exhumed, and arsenic traces were heavy in each and every one. The rest of her victims all died of asphyxia and were probably smothered in their sleep. Nanny was seen giggling in many photos and for the newspapers. Psychiatrists diagnosed her mentally sane, and she pled guilty to all of her charges. Nanny was sentenced to life in prison without the death penalty simply because she was a female. Nanny died of leukemia in 1965. My thoughts? We don't really come across a lot of people like Nanny Doss. She was probably one of the worst serial killers and just simply got away with it because back in her time, things weren't diagnosed as easily and she was given the benefit of the doubt a lot of the time. It's hard for me to understand how someone could kill their entire family, but she must have been severely mentally unstable, mentally ill to want to have everybody in her life dead when they just mildly inconvenienced her. Prison was probably the best place for her. What are your thoughts? What do you think of Nanny Doss? Thanks again for joining me here at Felony Spectator, and we'll see you again soon.